My roommates had a baby 6 months ago and now expect me to be free childcare. When I started saying no, they acted like I was betraying them after everything they've done for me. Yesterday, they told me I owe them for reducing my rent. I'm 24 years old and I genuinely thought I'd found the perfect living situation last year. I was so wrong. Let me explain how I got here. I work as a graphic designer for a small marketing agency in the city. The pay's okay, around $42,000 a year before taxes. But anyone who lives in an expensive city knows that doesn't go far. I was renting a studio apartment for $1,400 a month, which left me with barely anything after utilities, food, and my car payment. I was eating pasta and canned sauce for dinner most nights, and my savings account had $230 in it. One emergency, and I would have been completely screwed. Last September, I was scrolling through apartment listings during my lunch break when I saw a posting for a room in a three-bedroom apartment. $750 a month plus a third of utilities. The location was good, the photos looked clean, and it would save me almost $700 a month. I messaged immediately. The couple who had the lease, Devin and Marissa, responded within an hour asking if I wanted to meet up and see the place. We met at a coffee shop near the apartment first. They were both in their early 30s, seemed put together and professional. Devin worked in finance, doing something with investment portfolios that went over my head when he explained it. Marissa was a pharmaceutical sales representative who traveled a few days a week visiting doctors' offices. They'd been living in the apartment for 3 years and were looking for a third roommate because their previous one had moved in with her boyfriend. They asked basic questions about my job, my schedule, whether I was clean and paid bills on time. I asked about house rules, whether they had people over a lot, noise expectations. Everything seemed normal and straightforward. The apartment itself was nice. Hardwood floors, updated kitchen. My room was a decent size with its own bathroom attached. The third bedroom was set up as Devin's home office. Common areas were neat and well maintained. They told me they both worked long hours and sometimes traveled for work, so they really just needed someone responsible and respectful. That was me exactly. We shook hands and I moved in 2 weeks later. The first few months were honestly great. We were friendly roommates who coexisted peacefully. Sometimes we'd order pizza together on Friday nights or watch a movie in the living room, but mostly we did our own thing. I'd come from work, make dinner, work on freelance projects in my room, and have the place mostly to myself since they were often out or working late. Devin traveled twice for conferences, and Marissa was gone 2 or 3 days a week for her sales territory. I kept my space clean, paid rent on the first of every month, and we never had any conflicts. It felt like I'd finally found stability. Then, in January, Marissa told me she was pregnant. They were both excited, but clearly nervous about it. I congratulated them and immediately asked the practical question of whether they'd need my room for the nursery. I was already mentally preparing to start apartment hunting again. But Marissa quickly said no, they were planning to convert Devin's office into the nursery. He'd just move his desk and computer into their bedroom. She actually said they hoped I would stay because having someone else in the apartment would be helpful. She called me trustworthy and responsible, which made me feel good. I told them congratulations again and that I'd definitely stay. Everything continued normally for the next few months. Marissa had morning sickness that sometimes lasted all afternoon, and I tried to be considerate. I kept noise down when she was resting, and a few times when I was at the grocery store, I'd text to ask if she needed anything. She always seemed grateful when I'd grab her some ginger ale or saltines. Around her 6th month, baby furniture started arriving. I helped Devin haul a heavy crib box up 3 flights of stairs because the delivery guys had just left it in the lobby. We were becoming actual friends, not just people splitting rent. Marissa gave birth in early June to a baby girl they named Haven. I sent flowers to the hospital with a card saying congratulations. When they brought Haven home 3 days later, I tried to give them space. I figured new parents needed time to adjust and bond without a roommate hovering. I could hear the baby crying through the walls at all hours, which was expected. I'm normally a heavy sleeper, so it didn't bother me too much. On the particularly rough nights, I used earplugs. They both looked exhausted whenever I ran into them in the kitchen or hallway, but they seemed happy. 2 weeks after Haven came home, Marissa knocked on my bedroom door around 7 in the evening. I was working on a freelance logo design project, trying to build up my savings now that I was spending less on rent. She asked if I had a minute to talk. When I said, sure, she came in and sat on the edge of my bed. She looked tired but hopeful. She started by saying how grateful they were to have me as a roommate, especially during this adjustment period. Then she asked if I would be willing to watch Haven for just 2 hours that Saturday evening. She explained that they'd been invited to a dinner party at Devon's coworker's house. They hadn't left the apartment since bringing Haven home and were feeling overwhelmed. She promised it would only be 2 hours, they'd be just 20 minutes away, and Haven would probably sleep the entire time anyway since it would be during her usual sleep window. I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety. I've never been comfortable around babies. I'm an only child, never babysat as a teenager, and the few times friends have handed me their infants, I've stood there rigid with fear of dropping them or doing something wrong. But Marissa looked so hopeful sitting there, and they'd been nothing but good roommates to me. It was just 2 hours. I heard myself saying yes before I could overthink it. Saturday evening arrived, and I regretted my decision immediately. They gave me a 20-minute tutorial on everything: how to prepare a bottle, how to burp her, how to change a diaper, what to do if she cried. Marissa wrote their phone numbers on a notepad and stuck it to the refrigerator, even though I already had both their numbers. She must have said, "Call us if you need anything," at least 6 times. Devin showed me how the baby monitor worked. Then they left, and I was alone in the apartment with a 2-week-old baby. For the first hour, Haven slept. I sat on the couch with my laptop, trying to work on my freelance project, but jumping every time I heard a sound through the baby monitor sitting next to me. Every gurgle and sigh made my heart race. Then, at 8:15, she started crying. I went to the nursery and picked her up carefully, supporting her head like they'd shown me. I checked her diaper. It was wet, so I changed it, fumbling with the tabs and using probably twice as many wipes as necessary. She kept crying. I tried giving her the bottle they'd prepared. She wouldn't take it. I rocked her, walked around the room, tried the shushing sound Marissa had demonstrated. Nothing worked. She just cried and cried, this piercing wail that made my anxiety shoot through the roof. After 45 minutes of nonstop crying, I called Marissa. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. She answered immediately, and I could hear restaurant noise in the background. I explained that I'd tried everything and Haven wouldn't stop crying. Marissa walked me through some additional techniques, her voice calm and reassuring. She said I was doing great and that sometimes babies just cry. She said they'd leave in 30 minutes and be home soon. I felt like a complete failure as I hung up. Those 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. I paced the living room holding Haven, bouncing slightly and trying not to cry myself. Finally, miraculously, she fell asleep about 5 minutes before they got home. I was terrified to move or even breathe too deeply. I just stood there frozen in the middle of the living room holding the sleeping baby. When they came in, Marissa gently took Haven from my arms, and Devin handed me 2 $20 bills. He said I was a lifesaver and they really appreciated it. I took the money because refusing seemed rude, but I felt like I should be paying them for the stress I just experienced. After they took Haven to the nursery, I went to my room and felt my whole body relax for the first time in 3 hours. I thought that would be it. A one-time emergency favor for new parents who desperately needed a break. It wasn't. 3 days later, Marissa asked if I could watch Haven again on Thursday evening. They had another event, this time a birthday dinner for Devon's sister. Just 3 hours this time. I wanted to say no. Every part of me wanted to say no. But I hesitated too long, and Marissa must have taken that as a maybe because she started explaining how much that first night out had helped them mentally, how they just needed a little adult time occasionally to stay sane. I heard myself agreeing again. Thursday went slightly better only because Haven slept the entire time. I sat on the couch, barely breathing, watching the baby monitor like it was going to explode. They came home, handed me $60, and thanked me profusely. I noticed they stayed out for almost 4 hours, not 3, but I didn't mention it. The next request came 5 days after that, then 4 days after that one. By mid-July, I was watching Haven at least twice a week, sometimes 3 times. The duration kept extending too. What started as 2 hours became 3, then 4, then an entire Saturday afternoon while they went to a barbecue. They always paid me, usually between $40 and $80, depending on how long they were gone. But the frequency was becoming exhausting. I work full-time. I do freelance projects in the evenings to build my savings. The last thing I wanted was to become an on-call babysitter for a newborn who still woke me up crying through the walls at 2 in the morning. But every time I thought about saying no, I'd see Marissa's hopeful face, or Devin would mention how much they appreciated having someone they trusted. The guilt kept me trapped. In early August, things shifted. I came home from work on a Wednesday to find Marissa in the kitchen making dinner, with Haven in a baby carrier strapped to her chest. She smiled when she saw me and said she was making pasta. Did I want some? I said sure, and we chatted while she cooked. Then, casually, as if it was nothing, she mentioned that she and Demon wanted to see a movie Friday night, the new action thriller that just came out. She didn't ask if I could watch Haven. She just said they had tickets for the 7 o'clock showing, so I'd need to be home by 6:30. I stood there holding my work bag, processing what had just happened. She had gone from asking to just informing me. I said I actually had plans Friday night. It was a lie. I didn't have plans, but I needed to establish some kind of boundary before this became my entire life. Marissa's face fell. She said, "Oh, that they'd already bought the tickets. Could I maybe cancel my plans? It was just this once." Except it wasn't just once. It was twice a week, every week for 2 months now. I said no, I couldn't cancel. My plans were important. Marissa got quiet and turned back to the stove. The rest of dinner was awkward. She barely spoke to me. When Devin came home, I heard them talking in low voices in their bedroom. I felt guilty, but also annoyed. I hadn't signed up to be their babysitter when I moved in. Friday came, and I left the apartment at 6 o'clock, before they needed to leave for their movie. I went to a coffee shop and sat there for 4 hours working on my laptop, occasionally wondering if I was being unreasonable. When I got home around 10:15, the apartment was dark. They were already back and in their room. I didn't see them at all that weekend. Monday morning, I found Devin in the kitchen making coffee. He was friendly enough, asked how my weekend was, the usual small talk. Then he said he and Marissa wanted to talk to me about something when I got home from work. My stomach dropped. I was convinced they were going to ask me to move out. I spent the entire day at work anxious and distracted. When I got home that evening, they were waiting in the living room. Haven was in her bouncer seat on the floor. They asked me to sit down, which made everything feel even more ominous. Then Devin started talking about how much they appreciated me as a roommate, how helpful I'd been with Haven, and how they wanted to make sure I felt valued. I waited for the other shoe to drop. Instead, Marissa said they'd decided to reduce my rent by $50 a month as a thank you for all the babysitting I'd been doing. $50. I'd been watching Haven twice a week for 2 months, usually 3 or 4 hours at a time, and they thought $50 off rent was appropriate compensation. I did the math in my head. I'd watched Haven probably 20 times, at an average of 3.5 hours per session. That was 70 hours of childcare. $50 a month worked out to about 71 cents per hour. But they were sitting there smiling like they'd just given me this amazing gift. Devin said they hoped this would make it easier for me to help out, since they knew I had to turn them down Friday. Marissa added that they were hoping to go out at least twice a week going forward, now that Haven was getting into more of a routine. Maybe Wednesday and Saturday evenings usually. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Another part wanted to be grateful for any rent reduction. Instead, I just said thank you and went to my room. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how I'd become the live-in nanny without ever agreeing to it. The new arrangement started immediately. Wednesday evening, Marissa knocked on my door to let me know they were leaving at 6:15 for dinner. Just a heads up, not a question. I watched Haven for 4 hours while they had a leisurely meal somewhere. When they got home, Devin thanked me and reminded me that my rent was now $700 starting next month. As if that settled everything. Saturday, same thing. They informed me they'd be leaving at 7 for a friend's housewarming party. I watched Haven for 5 hours this time. They came home after midnight, slightly tipsy, and Marissa gave me a quick hug and said I was the best before stumbling to their bedroom. This became the pattern. 2 to 3 times a week, they'd inform me they were going out and I'd be expected to watch Haven. Sometimes they'd give me a few hours' notice, sometimes a few days. The $50 rent reduction was mentioned frequently, always in the context of how generous it was and how it covered the babysitting. I started keeping track in a notes app on my phone. Hours watched, what I would have earned at even minimum wage versus what I was actually saving on rent. The numbers made me angry. By September, I was watching Haven 15 to 20 hours per week, sometimes more. They had expanded beyond just evenings. Could I watch her Saturday afternoon while Marissa got her hair done? Could I watch her Sunday morning while Devin played golf? Always with very little notice and always with the assumption I'd say yes. When I occasionally said I had plans or was busy, they'd get this disappointed look and make comments about how they'd really been counting on me. The breakthrough moment came in late September. I'd been asked to work on a rush project for a freelance client, something that would pay $800 but needed to be finished by Monday morning. It was Friday evening and I'd planned to work all weekend. When I got home from my regular job, Marissa was waiting in the living room. She said they'd been invited to a wedding on Saturday in a city 2 hours away. They'd be gone from noon until probably 11 at night. Could I watch Haven? I said, no. I explained about the freelance project and the deadline. Marissa's face hardened. She said this wedding was important. It was Devin's college roommate. They'd already RSVP'd yes. I said, I'm sorry, but I couldn't help this time. Maybe they could find another sitter or take Haven with them. Devin came out of their bedroom then and joined the conversation. He said they'd reduce my rent specifically so I'd be available to help with childcare. That was the deal. I said that wasn't the deal. I'd never agreed to be their on-call babysitter. The rent reduction was their idea, not something I'd asked for or negotiated. Devin got frustrated and said I was being difficult, that they'd done me a huge favor by reducing my rent and now I wouldn't help them when they really needed it. Marissa added that most babysitters would charge $15 or $20 an hour, and my rent reduction was actually very generous considering how much I helped out. I'd been doing the math for weeks. I pulled up my phone and showed them my notes. Since August 1st, I'd watched Haven 93 hours. At $15 per hour, that would be $1,395. My rent reduction for 2 months was $100 total. They'd underpaid me $1,295, and they thought they were being generous. The silence after I showed them those numbers was deafening. Devin stared at my phone screen, then looked at Marissa. She crossed her arms and said that wasn't fair, that I lived there and it wasn't the same as hiring a professional babysitter. I was family practically. Family helps each other out. I pointed out that family also asks before volunteering someone's time, and family doesn't treat their relatives like employees they're getting a discount on. Devin's face turned red. He said if I was going to be this way about it, maybe we needed to reconsider the living arrangement, that they'd offered me the rent reduction in good faith and I was throwing it back in their faces. I felt my chest tighten with anxiety, but I also felt something else. Anger. Real anger that I'd been suppressing for months. I told him they could absolutely reconsider the living arrangement, but I wasn't watching Haven this weekend. Then I went to my room and locked the door. I heard them arguing in hushed voices in the living room for almost an hour. Then their bedroom door slammed. I sat on my bed, shaking, partly from adrenaline and partly from fear that I'd just made myself homeless. But I also felt lighter somehow. I'd finally said no and meant it. Saturday morning, I left early and went to the library to work on my freelance project. I stayed there all day, coming home only after I was sure they'd have left for the wedding if they went. The apartment was empty when I got back. I worked through the night and finished the project by 4 a.m. Sunday. When I woke up around noon, I could hear them moving around in the apartment. I avoided them for the rest of Sunday. Monday morning, I transferred my rent payment, the full $750, not the reduced amount. In the memo line, I wrote, "For October." If they wanted to discuss the rent reduction, they could bring it up directly. I wasn't going to assume it was still in effect. That evening, Marissa knocked on my door.
She looked tired and uncomfortable. She said they found a babysitter for the wedding, one of Marissa's coworkers who had a teenage daughter. It cost them $120 for the day. She said this in a way that made it clear she thought it was my fault they'd had to spend that money. Then she said they'd talked and decided that maybe there had been some miscommunication about expectations. They still wanted to reduce my rent by $50, but they needed me to commit to watching Haven at least 2 evenings per week. Wednesday evenings, 6 to 10, those hours were non-negotiable unless I had something seriously important. I asked what counted as seriously important. She said work obligations or family emergencies, not just plans with friends or freelance work I could do another time. I felt trapped. If I said no, I'd probably have to move out. If I said yes, I was locked into 8 hours minimum of babysitting every week for $50 a month. That was $6.25 per hour, less than minimum wage in our state. I told her I needed to think about it. She looked annoyed but said, okay, let her know by tomorrow. After she left, I started looking at apartment listings. My $700 savings from living here had grown to almost $4,000. Not enough for first, last, and deposit on most places, but maybe enough for some. Everything I found in my price range was either a studio in a terrible neighborhood or had roommate situations that looked sketchy. I'd gotten used to having my own bathroom and living in a safe area. The thought of starting over was exhausting. Tuesday evening, I told them I'd agree to Wednesday evenings, 6 to 10, as a regular commitment. But Saturdays needed to stay flexible based on my schedule. If I was available, I'd help, but I couldn't guarantee every single Saturday. Devin looked like he wanted to argue, but Marissa put her hand on his arm and said, that was fair. So we had our new arrangement. For about 3 weeks, it worked okay. I watched Haven every Wednesday evening and about 2 out of 3 Saturdays. They went to dinner, to movies, to friends' houses. I stayed home with a baby who was getting more alert and harder to settle. She'd started teething and would cry for hours sometimes. I'd walk circles around the apartment bouncing her, my arms aching, while they enjoyed their child-free evenings. Then, in late October, things escalated again. Marissa's company was having a conference in another city, Thursday through Sunday, 4 days. She asked if I could watch Haven while Devin was at work during the day. Just Thursday and Friday, from 8 in the morning until 6 at night when Devin got home. She'd pay me, she promised. Actual money this time, not just rent reduction. I said I had my own job. I couldn't take 2 days off work to babysit. She said, couldn't I work from home? I reminded her I work for a marketing agency, not remotely. I had to be in the office. She got quiet, then asked if there was any way I could take those days off, use sick days or vacation days. I stared at her in disbelief. She was asking me to use my limited paid time off from my actual job to watch her child so she could go to a work conference. I said no. She looked panicked and said she didn't know what else to do. Devin couldn't take off work. His boss was already annoyed about all the time he'd taken for baby appointments. Her mom lived 6 hours away and couldn't come on short notice. Could she please, just this once, help them out? I suggested she look into daycare or professional babysitting services. She said those cost a fortune and they'd already spent so much on childcare. Wait, they'd already spent so much on childcare? This was news to me. I asked what she meant. She admitted they'd been hiring that teenager, the coworker's daughter, for other times when I wasn't available. They'd spent over $600 on her in the past month, but they couldn't afford to pay her for 2 full days. It would be almost $300. I felt my blood pressure rising. They were paying a teenager more per hour than they were effectively paying me with the rent reduction, and now they wanted me to sacrifice my own job benefits to help them avoid paying for childcare. I said no again, firmly. Marissa's eyes filled with tears. She said she didn't understand why I was being so difficult about this, that we were supposed to be like family, that she'd always helped me when I needed it. I asked when exactly she'd helped me. She listed off things like including me in their pizza orders and giving me advice about my freelance work. Nothing that actually cost her anything or required real sacrifice. I went to work Thursday and Friday like normal. I don't know what they ended up doing for childcare. When I got home Friday evening, the apartment was tense and cold. Devin barely acknowledged me. Saturday morning, I woke up to find a note slipped under my door. It was from both of them, typed and printed out like an official document. It outlined new house rules. Quiet hours were now from 7 at night to 7 in the morning, meaning I couldn't have guests or watch TV in the living room during those times. I was expected to keep all my belongings in my room, nothing in common areas. And the rent was going back up to the original $750 starting November 1st. The note also said that if I wanted to continue living there, I needed to be a more cooperative member of the household. It didn't specify what that meant, but the implication was clear. Be available to babysit when they needed it, or move out. I read that note 3 times, feeling my face get hot with anger. The quiet hours from 7 to 7 were clearly designed to make my life difficult. Haven cried all throughout the night, and they'd never worried about noise before. This was retaliation for not sacrificing my job for their convenience. I took a photo of the note and sent it to my best friend Rachel, asking if this seemed insane. She called immediately and said it was completely insane and I needed to move out as soon as possible. But moving out required money I didn't quite have yet and time to find a place. I was trapped for at least another month or two. I sent them a text saying I'd received their note and would comply with the new house rules. I didn't mention the rent increase or the cooperative member comment. I just needed to keep things stable until I could leave. November started, and the atmosphere in the apartment was toxic. They'd stopped including me in anything. No more Friday pizza nights or casual chats in the kitchen. When I came home from work, they'd take Haven and go into their bedroom, closing the door. It was like I was a stranger living in their space. Fine by me. I spent every evening in my room working on freelance projects, saving every dollar I could.
Then on Wednesday, November 8th, Marissa knocked on my door at 5:30. I was already dreading what she was going to say. She asked if I was still planning to watch Haven that evening since Wednesday was my committed night. I had honestly forgotten. With how cold things had been between us, I'd assumed our arrangement was over. But technically, I had agreed to Wednesday evenings. I said yes, I could watch her. Devin and Marissa left at 6:15 for dinner. Haven was fussy from the moment they walked out the door. She'd been fighting a cold all week and was congested and miserable. I tried everything. Bottle, diaper change, rocking, walking, singing songs I barely remembered from my own childhood. Nothing worked. She screamed for 2 solid hours. At 8:30, I texted Marissa that Haven was inconsolable and asked if there was anything else I should try. No response. I texted Devin. No response. At 9:15, Haven finally exhausted herself and fell asleep in my arms. I was sweating, my ears were ringing from the crying, and I felt like I'd been through a war. I carefully set her in the bouncer seat and collapsed on the couch. They didn't come home until almost midnight. When they walked in, Marissa checked her phone and saw my texts. She said, "Oh, sorry, we put our phones away to enjoy dinner." Then she picked up Haven without even asking how the evening went, and they both went to their bedroom. I sat there stunned. I'd just spent 6 hours dealing with their screaming sick baby. They'd ignored my texts asking for help, came home 3 hours later than they'd said they would, and didn't even acknowledge it. I went to my room and started seriously looking at apartments, even the sketchy ones. The next morning, Thursday, I woke up to use the bathroom at 6 and heard Haven crying. Normal for that time of morning. But when I left for work at 7:30, she was still crying. And when I got home at 5:45 that evening, I could hear her crying the moment I stepped into the building. I unlocked the apartment door to find Marissa on the couch, looking completely defeated, holding a screaming Haven. Devin wasn't home yet. Marissa looked up at me with red, exhausted eyes and said the pediatrician thought Haven might have an ear infection. They'd given her antibiotics but said it would take 24 to 48 hours to start working. She'd been crying almost non-stop since this morning. Marissa looked absolutely destroyed. Part of me felt sorry for her, but a larger part of me thought about how I'd dealt with the same screaming baby alone last night while they enjoyed a leisurely dinner with their phones off. I made myself dinner and ate in my room with my door closed, trying to block out the crying. Around 8, my door flew open. Devin stood there looking furious. He said I could hear his daughter crying, and I was just sitting in here eating dinner like nothing was wrong. I said, yes, I could hear her crying, just like they'd been able to hear her crying through my texts last night when they chose not to respond. His face went purple. He said that was completely different. They'd needed one evening to themselves. I said I also needed evenings to myself, which is why I had a job and a life that didn't revolve around their baby. He stepped into my room, which he'd never done before, and said if I was going to live under their roof, I needed to show some basic human decency and help when his daughter was sick. I stood up from my desk and said, this wasn't their roof. We all paid rent here equally. Well, I paid more than my share, actually, since my room was the smallest, and I'd helped plenty. I'd watched Haven for well over 100 hours at this point, usually with little notice and for barely any compensation. I was done being their backup parent. Marissa appeared in the doorway with a still crying Haven. She said they'd reduced my rent specifically so I'd be available to help with childcare, and I was violating our agreement. I said our agreement was for Wednesday evenings and occasional Saturdays, not emergency sick baby care at all hours. And they'd already raised my rent back to the original amount, so the reduction wasn't even in effect anymore. How was I violating an agreement that no longer existed? They both stared at me. I could tell they hadn't expected me to push back this hard. Finally, Devin said if I wasn't willing to be a team player, maybe I should start looking for somewhere else to live. I said I'd already been looking and would be out by the end of December. The relief on Marissa's face was immediate and obvious. She said, good, that would probably be best for everyone. Then they went back to their room and closed the door. I sat on my bed, shaking with adrenaline. I'd just given my notice. Sort of. Or they'd kicked me out. Either way, I had less than 2 months to find a new place and move. I opened my laptop and spent 4 hours searching apartments, running numbers, and filling out rental applications for anything that seemed remotely livable. The next 3 weeks were miserable. We maintained a cold but civil distance. I spent as little time in the common areas as possible. I'd stopped watching Haven entirely, even on Wednesday evenings. They didn't ask, and I didn't offer. I heard them hiring that teenager more frequently, and once I overheard Devin complaining on the phone to someone about how much they were spending on childcare now that their ungrateful roommate had bailed on them. I found an apartment. A tiny one-bedroom in a neighborhood that wasn't as nice as where I'd been living, but it was safe enough and within my budget. $950 a month, so more than I'd been paying, but less than my original studio. I'd have my own space and no one else's baby keeping me awake at night. I paid the deposit and first month's rent, wiping out most of my savings, and scheduled my move for December 23rd. I told Devin and Marissa in early December that I'd be out by the 23rd. They said fine and asked if I'd be willing to pay through the end of December, since that was proper notice. I reminded them that they'd essentially kicked me out, so no, I'd be paying through the 23rd and not a day more. Marissa got huffy and said they'd have to scramble to find a new roommate now. I didn't point out that they'd have to scramble either way since it was December and most people weren't apartment hunting during the holidays. The weeks crawled by. I packed my belongings gradually, box by box, stacking them in my room. Every time I carried a box through the living room, they'd watch me like I was stealing something. I'd paid December rent in full, but they acted like I was skipping out on a debt. December 21st, 2 days before my move, I came home from work to find Marissa in the kitchen making dinner. Haven was in the high chair, smashing sweet potatoes around on the tray. Marissa smiled at me, which was jarring after weeks of cold silence. She said she and Devin had been talking, and they felt bad about how things had ended up. They didn't want me to leave on bad terms. She asked if I would be willing to sit down with both of them that evening and talk things through. I was suspicious, but agreed. After dinner, we sat in the living room. Haven was already asleep in her room. Devin started by saying they appreciated everything I'd done to help with Haven over the past few months. They recognized that they'd maybe relied on me too much without properly compensating me. Marissa added that they'd been overwhelmed as new parents and hadn't handled things well. It all sounded rehearsed, but sincere enough. Then came the real reason for the conversation. They'd been trying to find a new roommate, but weren't having any luck. December was a terrible time to find someone, and January wasn't looking much better. They were really stressed about covering the full rent on their own, especially with all the baby expenses. They asked if I'd be willing to stay through January, maybe February, just until they found someone. They'd reduced my rent to $600 a month as an apology and to make it worth my while. I said no, immediately.
I'd already signed a lease on my new place and paid the deposit. Marissa said, couldn't I get out of it? It had only been a few weeks. Maybe I could talk to the landlord. I said I didn't want to get out of it. I was ready to leave and live on my own. Devin said they'd really be struggling financially if they had to cover my portion of rent for several months. They might even have to move, which would be so hard with a baby. The manipulation was so transparent, I almost laughed. I said I was sorry they were in a difficult position, but I'd given them notice and would be moving as planned. Marissa's fake friendliness disappeared instantly. She said, we really should have known better than to rent to someone so young and selfish, that they'd opened their home to me, treated me like family, and this is how I repaid them. Devin added, I was leaving them in a terrible situation right before the holidays, which was just cruel. I stood up and said I was done with this conversation. I'd paid my rent through my move date and didn't owe them anything beyond that. Marissa called after me as I walked to my room saying they'd counted on me to be more mature than this. I closed my door and locked it. December 23rd finally arrived. I'd hired 2 guys from a moving service I found online to help me load my furniture. They showed up at 8 in the morning with a truck. Devin and Marissa stayed in their bedroom with the door closed the entire time, even though Haven was crying and clearly needed attention. It took 3 hours to load everything. As I was doing my final walkthrough to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything, Marissa came out holding Haven. She said she really hoped I'd reconsider and stay through January at least. They still hadn't found anyone, and the rent was due in just over a week. I said no again. She asked if I could at least recommend anyone who might want the room. I said I didn't know anyone looking for a place right now, which was true. She shifted Haven to her other hip and said they'd really counted on me being more reliable, that when they'd reduced my rent back in August, it was with the understanding that I'd be a long-term roommate who helped with Haven.
I finally snapped. I told her they'd reduce my rent by $50 a month as supposed payment for unlimited babysitting, then raised it back to full price when I set boundaries, and now they're acting like I'd broken some sacred promise. The only understanding we'd had was that I'd pay rent and be a respectful roommate. I'd done both. Their failure to plan for my departure wasn't my emergency. Devin came out of the bedroom then, and I could tell from his expression he'd been listening. He said I was being incredibly selfish and immature, that they'd given me an affordable place to live and all they'd asked for in return was occasional help with their daughter. I was abandoning them when they needed me most. I looked between the two of them and realized there was no point continuing this conversation. They genuinely believed they were the victims here. I walked out and got in my car. The movers were already heading to my new apartment with my furniture. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw Marissa standing in the window, holding Haven, watching me leave. I felt a brief pang of guilt, then reminded myself of every evening I'd spent trapped in that apartment with a screaming baby while they enjoyed their freedom. The guilt faded. My new apartment was tiny, but mine. Just me, no surprise babies, no entitled roommates expecting free labor. I spent Christmas alone unpacking boxes and eating takeout Chinese food. It was the most peaceful holiday I'd had in years. I didn't hear from them for 2 weeks. Then, in early January, Devin texted me. Just the simple message asking if I'd reconsidered staying through January. I replied that I'd already moved and my lease there had ended December 23rd, so no. He responded asking if I could help them cover part of January's rent since they still hadn't found a roommate. I didn't respond. 3 days later, Marissa called. I let it go to voicemail. She left a long, rambling message about how they were really struggling. The full rent was almost $3,000 a month, and they couldn't afford it on their own with all of Haven's expenses. She said she knew we'd had our differences, but she was hoping I could loan them just $1,000 to help cover January. She'd pay me back by March, she promised. I deleted the voicemail without responding. The audacity of asking me for money after everything that had happened was almost impressive. 2 days after that, I got a Venmo request from Devin for $800 with the note, January rent contribution. I declined it immediately and blocked both of them on Venmo. The texts and calls continued sporadically through January. Each one was some variation of asking for money or asking if I knew anyone who wanted to rent a room. I kept my responses minimal or didn't respond at all. By late January, the messages took on a more disparate tone. Devin texted saying they might have to break their lease and move somewhere cheaper. Marissa sent a long text about how hard it was being new parents and how my leaving had really damaged them financially at the worst possible time. I felt bad for about 30 seconds, then remembered every time they'd dismissed my needs, ignored my boundaries, and treated me like live-in staff. I'd paid every dollar I owed them. Their financial planning wasn't my responsibility. In early February, I got a text from an unknown number. It was Devon's sister, the one whose birthday dinner I refused to babysit for, months ago. She said Devon and Marissa had told her what happened and she was disappointed in me. They'd given me an incredible deal on rent and I'd thrown it back in their faces. She said young people today had no sense of gratitude or community. I blocked her number without responding. The final contact came in mid-February. I was at work when I got an email from Marissa, a long, multi-paragraph email about how they'd had to move. They'd found a smaller, cheaper apartment but had to break their lease early and pay a penalty. They'd also had to pay for movers with very short notice. All of this had cost them nearly $4,000 that they didn't have. The email went on to explain that this financial stress was affecting their marriage and their ability to care for Haven properly. She said, I bore partial responsibility for this situation because I'd left without proper notice and refused to help them transition. The email ended with a direct request. She wanted me to contribute $1,500 toward their moving costs and lease-breaking penalty. She said it was only fair since my abrupt departure had caused this chain of events. She included her Venmo handle and said she hoped I'd do the right thing. I read that email 3 times, each time getting angrier. I'd given them nearly 3 weeks of notice. I'd paid every cent of rent I owed them. I'd watched their baby for over 100 hours for barely any compensation. And now she was trying to make me financially responsible for their decision to break their lease? I drafted a long response detailing everything they'd put me through, every boundary they'd violated, every manipulation they'd attempted. Then I deleted it and wrote something simpler. I told her I'd fulfilled all my obligations as a tenant and wouldn't be sending any money. I wished them well and asked them to not contact me again. Then I blocked both their email addresses. I haven't heard from them since. It's been almost 4 months now. Sometimes I wonder how they're doing, whether they found a new roommate to take advantage of, whether Haven is healthy and happy. Mostly, though, I don't think about them at all. My tiny 1-bedroom apartment costs more than that room did, and I'm back to careful budgeting. But I come home to silence. No crying baby through the walls at 2 in the morning, no entitled roommates expecting me to sacrifice my time and energy for their convenience. No guilt trips about family and helping each other out. Just me, my space, and my life on my terms. I've learned some things from this experience. I learned that helping people shouldn't come at the cost of being taken advantage of. I learned that family isn't determined by proximity or convenience. It's built on mutual respect and genuine care. And I learned that sometimes the most important boundary you can set is the one that protects your own peace. Last week, I ran into Devon's coworker at the grocery store, the one whose teenage daughter they'd been hiring to babysit. We'd met a few times when I still lived there. She recognized me and came over to chat. After some small talk, she mentioned that Devon and Marissa had asked if her daughter could start watching Haven 3 days a week after school. Her daughter had agreed initially, but quit after 2 weeks because they kept coming home later than promised and arguing about payment. Apparently, they'd tried to pay her $50 for 15 hours of work, claiming that was fair because she was practically family after watching Haven so much. The daughter had demanded the $150 they'd agreed on, and they'd called her spoiled and entitled. She'd walked out and blocked their numbers. The coworker said she told Devon and Marissa they had some nerve treating a 16-year-old that way, and they got defensive and said everyone was being unreasonable with them. I thanked her for telling me and said I wasn't surprised at all. She shook her head and said some people never learn. We talked for a few more minutes, then went our separate ways. As I loaded groceries into my car, I felt this wave of relief that I'd gotten out when I did. That could have been me, still trapped in that apartment, still being manipulated and underpaid and made to feel guilty for having boundaries. I'm not going to pretend my life is perfect now. Money is tight, my apartment has quirks, and I'm still building my freelance client base back up after the chaos of moving. But it's my chaos, my struggle, my life. And that makes all the difference.
So, to anyone reading this who's in a similar situation, being slowly roped into more and more obligations by roommates or family or anyone else, here's what I wish someone had told me earlier. Your time has value. Your boundaries matter. And anyone who makes you feel guilty for protecting your own well-being isn't someone who has your best interests at heart. Get out before you're too deep. Get out before their emergency becomes your permanent responsibility. Get out while you still can. I got out, and I've never regretted it.